Chairman, the meeting is now live streaming.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome to the Lincolnshire Police and Crime Panel. Tonight's meeting is a confirmatory hearing for the Chief Constable of Lincolnshire, and we will run through the business as the agenda is outlined. Commissioner, welcome to you and your staff, and thank you for coming this evening. And Mr. Howard, a warm welcome to you as the preferred candidate.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Also, a welcome to the members of the public who are listening to this meeting this evening, and to members of the media who are also listening. So what I'll do, Mr. Howard, as a matter of courtesy, I'll invite our members to introduce themselves to you so you know who everybody is. It won't be easy to remember on your first occasion, as I appreciate, but I think it would be useful for them to introduce themselves. So I'll run it from the top of my list on my participants list. James Gilbert, please.
Thank you, Chairman. James Gilbert, Assistant Director for Organisation and Corporate Services at East Lindsey District Council, and Media Advisor to the panel.
Thank you, James. Catherine Walton.
Good evening, I'm Catherine Walton. I am a Democratic Services and Police and Crime Panel Officer, and I'll be taking the minutes of the meeting tonight.
Thank you, Catherine. Mr. Kraviatz.
Good evening, I'm George Kraviatz, a co-opted independent member of the panel. Thank you.
Councillor Wotton.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. My name is Councillor Ray Wotton. I represent South Kesteven District Council, and I'm currently the Vice Chairman. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Pepper.
Yeah, good evening. Councillor Nigel Pepper. I'm both a County Councillor and a South Holland District Councillor.
Thank you very much. Councillor Boothroyd.
Good evening. Councillor Richard Boothroyd, representing Lincolnshire County Council.
Thank you. Councillor Waring.
Councillor Waring, representing North Kesteven District Council.
Thank you, Councillor Waring. Councillor Young.
You're on mute, Barry.
Apologies. I am Barry Young. I'm Lincolnshire County Councillor, Executive Councillor for Community Safety, and I'm also Chairman of the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership and the last ever Chairman of the Police Authority.
Thank you. Councillor Marsh.
Good evening, I'm Graham Marsh and I'm the Deputy Leader at East Lindsey District Council.
Thank you, Councillor Marsh. Councillor Woodliff.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Councillor Stephen Woodliff of Boston Borough Council.
Thank you. And I'm just looking down my list. Michelle Sachs, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, I'm Michelle Sachs. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive at both Boston and East Lindsey District Councils, and I'm also the Monitoring Officer for the PCP. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Newton, I don't think I introduced you, so apologies for that.
That's okay. Councillor Angela Newton, I'm here this evening representing Lincolnshire County Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Nikki Harding, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Nikki Harding, Head of HR and OD at PSPS, also HR Advisor to the Board.
Thank you very much. So there's a long list for you there, Mr. Howard. So I know it will be difficult in these circumstances to remember everybody. And my name's Chris Cook. I'm an independent co-optee chair of the Police and Crime Panel in Lincolnshire. I also am the independent chair of the Safeguarding Children's Partnership for Lincolnshire and the Public Protection Board in Lincolnshire as well. So moving on then to item 2, apologies for absence, please, Catherine.
We have one apology, Mr. Chairman, and that's from Councillor Anne Welburn.
Thank you for that. Do we have any disclosure of interest from any member this evening, please? Can't see any disclosure of interest. So we will now move then to item 4 on the agenda, the Chief Constable confirmation hearing. And the purpose is to conduct a Chief Constable confirmation hearing in accordance with Schedule 8 of the Police Reform and Social Responsibility Act 2011. Now, in terms of this, Mr. Howard, I'll give you the format of this. The members will be asking the Commissioner some questions, and then that will be followed by our members asking you a number of questions as well. But before our questions, Commissioner, would you like to speak, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Just first of all, to thank the panel for convening this evening to deal with tonight's business. I think it's the single most important bit of business that collectively we convene to do, and I think it's no understatement to say this matters greatly to Lincolnshire Police, but also to every resident and visitor to the county. So it is a very important piece of business that we discuss tonight, and it's obviously been some time in getting to this point of proceedings. We have carried out a very thorough, robust process to get to the point of bringing you a preferred candidate this evening, and I'm sure that members will have some appropriate and searching questions for us on all of that. But I haven't got anything further I wish to add at this stage, but obviously I'm very willing and able to answer your questions.
Right, thank you very much, Commissioner. So first question from Councillor Boutroyd, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner, why do you believe that Mr. Howard is the best person to lead Lincolnshire Police as its Chief Constable?
Well, thank you for your question, Councillor. I mean, I think it's clearly evident from the paperwork that's been provided that Chris Howard is a highly experienced chief officer. He's got a wealth of experience, knowledge and skills that he would bring to this role, and that he executes in his current role very, very well. He described his vision for Lincolnshire as the safest place to live, work and visit. It was clear that during interview, he'd undertaken a huge amount of research and held discussions with key stakeholders to ascertain the current challenges facing the force, as well as organisational development by the force. It was a well thought out vision, and Chris described a clear and inclusive approach to implementation. He clearly indicated that he wants to be a visible and accessible leader, which very much appealed to myself, but also the panel, and indeed to the staff association panel, who thought that his presentation to them was very good indeed. It was clear that the style of work that Chris prefers is very collaborative style, would want to work very closely with the PCC and other partners, and that he's a very open, honest, supportive leader, and would look to build those kind of relationships across many partnerships. And in short, it was exactly the kind of style of leadership that I believe Lincolnshire needs and Lincolnshire Police needs at this moment in time to take it from strength to strength. So I have no hesitation in saying that I honestly believe that Mr. Howard is the right person to take the force forward.
Thank you, Commissioner. Councillor Boutroyd, did you want to come back on that at all?
No, I think it was a very comprehensive answer, and we look forward to working with Mr. Howard going forward.
Okay, thank you. Next question for the Commissioner, Mr. Kraviatz, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Could the Commissioner please inform the panel how the candidate satisfied the essential criteria for appointment?
Again, thank you for the question, Mr. Kraviatz. And I think this is a really important question, as was the first. But, you know, there are certain things that we have to make sure that all candidates that enter the process are compliant with before they will even get to the stage of interview. Just to run through this, because it is quite a specific question. So the candidate has successfully completed his senior PNAT course. He's successfully completed the Strategic Command course, both of which are requirements to being able to be considered for the position. He has held the rank of Detective Chief Constable in his current role, which is for the East Midlands collaboration, covering a 5-force area, and he's doing that exceptionally well. He's got wide-ranging operational law enforcement experience, which is demonstrated throughout his application form. He's got proven experience of successfully engaging and influencing a range of multi-agency partnerships, and he's got a very clear, demonstrable track record of successful experience working at a strategic level, including the leadership of law enforcement officers and staff at the executive level. He's also got experience of accountability, of management, and managing significant budgets as part of that. And he's got a track record of implementing successful large-scale complex change. So in short, there was no question by the appointments panel that Mr. Howard did indeed meet the essential criteria.
Thank you for that very comprehensive answer, Commissioner. Could you tell us how was the criteria marked and what weight was given to each separate criteria?
Well, the methodology that was used is designed by the College of Policing, so we followed their guidance in the methodology. Sarah Farmer, who is with us tonight, worked very closely with the College of Policing, and in fact, a representative senior psychologist from the College of Policing was present throughout the process and offered support and advice to ensure that all of those areas were indeed complied with. So the scoring was completed using the recommended methodology of the College of Policing, and they were there to witness to make sure that they were comfortable that it had been followed.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Kraviatz. Thank you, Commissioner. That completes our questions of you. So thank you very much for your responses. Mr. Howard, we've got a number of questions for you. So the first question is from Councillor Wotton, please.
Yes, good evening again, Mr. Howard. What qualities do you offer to make you the best candidate to lead Lincolnshire Police?
Okay, I think the first thing I've got to say is I'm excited by it. So I'm really looking forward to taking up the challenge that Lincolnshire Police presents. But in terms of the leadership style and the qualities I'd bring, I think I'd reference my personal leadership style and values about being selfless, being compassionate, and being engaged. The Commissioner's already talked about my preferred style, about being collaborative and collegiate. And I firmly believe in 2,000 brains being better than one. So I will be seeking to engage the whole force and beyond the force as well, and partners in trying to drive Lincolnshire Police forward and build upon the strengths that Chief Constable Skelly is going to leave behind for me. But it's also about my integrity and courage to do the right thing and to push the boundaries of thinking, which I've been doing across the East Midlands over the past 3 years, looking at how we can develop our innovative approaches around digital footprint, but also how we can then police in a different way, which will hopefully make a difference to the large geography that we have to cover with the restricted resources that Lincolnshire Police have. So it's really about the selflessness, the compassion, being engaged, collegiate and collaborative, but it's also about the courage to do the right thing and stand up for Lincolnshire Police and work in that really complex environment. But I think the way I'd sum it up is some feedback from a 360 assessment I had from a member of Lincolnshire Police who I've worked with recently, who simply said, I can create an environment where it's very easy to work very hard and I feel empowered, trusted and rewarded. If I can get to the point where everybody in Lincolnshire Police feels that way, empowered, trusted and rewarded, then I'll feel like I've made a difference.
Thank you very much, Mr. Howard. So what is your view then of the latest report that shows morale of Lincolnshire Police low?
I think that's a worrying report. I've had a look through that already. Much of it is actually mirroring where the national picture is, but actually there are significant areas where Lincolnshire is below the national average and in some cases in the bottom 2 or 3 forces in the country. I think there's a lot of work to be done with the rank and file, that's just police officers and police staff alike, particularly around engagement, chief officer engagement with them, making sure that they're involved in strategic planning for the future and actually have a say in that. And that's where I'm my leadership style around the 2,000 brains are better than one, and it should be about we, not me, should hopefully address some of those. And subject to obviously this evening, one of the things I've already asked for as soon as I arrive is to meet with the Federation Chair and actually talk through that report and how we might take it forward and approach the problems that have been addressed in that. But it's a starting point from which we can make a real difference, but it requires engagement, it requires clarity of direction. And one of the things I'd like to do is actually build the psychological contract between the Chief Constable and the force. So the subconscious contract that everybody has, I want to get that out there and have a clear contract to say, this is how I will behave as a Chief Constable, and this is how you as a constable or a police staff member can hold me to account.
Thank you very much, Steve. Mr. Howard. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Councillor Walton. Next question, Councillor Marsh, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, Mr. Howard. Lincolnshire is made up of rural, coastal and urban communities with large seasonal population fluctuations. What personal qualities and experiences would you bring to the role to ensure policing meets the needs of the local communities across the whole of Lincolnshire?
Okay, thank you, Councillor. I think that's one of the intractable problems for Lincolnshire and how it and the problems it has to face, and the new Chief Constable coming in will have to look at it. It goes back to what I was just saying about my leadership style, about being collaborative and collegiate, and what that means is actually listening, learning and responding to the needs of those communities. And one thing I will be doing is leading some of that work around community engagement, going out and meeting the communities, looking at how we can engage with them through surveys, through social media, through face-to-face meetings. But one of the things I want to do as well is just look at how we've resourced community solutions teams. So we have a rural policing team. I think there's a wider role to be played there around actually having a broader community solutions team which goes out and looks at where the problems are, listens to the communities, listens to the victims, listens to vulnerable people and works with them to find solutions for them so that we offer better choices, better outcomes, which means they may have better futures. So it's very much about setting the tone around that. It's making sure that the force understand my desire to be collaborative and collegiate, working in partnership and working with our communities, but also looking for joint solutions with our communities and taking the broadest range of information we can. But we have to do that with purpose. We haven't got limitless resources, and it's a problem that as the Deputy Chief Constable in the East Midlands, I work across 5 counties. I have 1,200 people who work for me trying to cover those 5 counties, and there's always those difficulties around the differences of geography, the differences of community, the differences of threat and risk in each of those communities. So I do want to understand the baseline of where we are. I want to understand the communities we've got, why we have a disparity between East and West better, and actually how we can engage with those communities and look at not just how we solve the problems, but actually how we engage differently with different communities.
Thank you very much. I look forward to engaging with you if you're successful, which I'm sure you will be. It's interesting to hear the comment, the difference between the East and West. I live and represent the East. We see far too little of senior staff, and it'll be a pleasure to welcome you to the East and show you around.
I very much look forward to it, Councillor, and it was, just to give you some assurance, it was a challenge that I had as an ACC in Derbyshire around getting up to the far reaches of Glossop, as well as all the way down to the south end of the county, and I will put myself out there and you will see me there.
Thank you, Mr. Howard.
Okay,
thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Councillor Waring, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome. To take the previous question a little bit further, please, how will you ensure that Lincolnshire Police takes into account the needs of diverse and hard-to-reach communities across Lincolnshire, please?
Okay, I think the starting point for me here, Councillor, is why this matters to me as a person and not just as a Chief Constable, and why diversity is so important. So from a personal perspective, I don't know whether you're aware of this, but I was brought up in Africa at a time when segregation across South Africa and into the countries across it was still rife. and I was brought up by parents who didn't believe in that, and I went to a junior school, a black junior school in Africa, and I have never felt so welcome and so at home as I did in that school. So from a personal perspective, diversity and respect and fairness and equality is absolutely paramount to everything I do as a person and as a Chief Constable. So the first part is actually setting out my own personal beliefs and setting the tone for the force and saying why this matters. I think in terms of then delivering it, there are key networks that I can work with. So that would be the support networks within the force, community groups, community action groups, and my peers around partnership and the Safer Lincolnshire partnership, and how those bodies are actually engaging. There's a lot of work going on already in the force around the baseline assessment and where some of the biases across the force might happen and where some of that inequality sits. And I've already referenced some of the issues between East and West that I found in my research. And what I'd like to do is work with communities and work with partners about how we can find solutions to solve those. The other part I'd make comment on is if you look at the diversity and inclusion commitment from Lincolnshire Police at the moment, it equates to about 0.01% of the budget. Now, if we're going to be really serious about this, that is not appropriate. There needs to be a greater spend and a greater commitment to that, because I can go and do all of this face-to-face work with the communities, but unless I actually put my money where my mouth is, it's going to mean nothing to them. So I want to look at how I can build that diversity and inclusion team and how we can reach out a bit more. But I also think there's opportunities around changing the offer that we make and changing the way we communicate. This is a great example of how we can reach out to communities much more easily and much more frequently than we might have been able to do previously. But COVID will also change how we can do things in terms of employment, in terms of particularly people with caring responsibilities, disabilities. How can we use technology, home working, flexible working to include them better and change the offer so that they see that we're being serious about it? Because the engagement and the communication needs to be followed up with action. And just to give you some reassurance, in the work that I've been doing in the past couple of years across EMSU in the East Midlands, I've done a lot of work around this, around introducing a scheme called Walk a Mile, where people go and spend some time with somebody from a different background to understand their needs and then feed that back in to break down barriers to their progression or their happiness at work. I've looked at where rules are getting in the way of people joining the police service, so simple things around the competency-based application process instead of a CV-based process, things around fitness testing and pre-selection processes which are discriminatory in their own right. So just break down those. So it's about the detail as much as it is about the communication, and it's about the communication being meaningful and again having purpose and doing something with that once you've had it. And that over time builds confidence in our communities that we are listening, that I am listening, and as a Chief Constable I'm making sure something is done about it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Howard. I've enjoyed the words and I look forward to the actions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Councillor Waring. Councillor Pepper, you may feel that Mr. Howard has already answered your question, but you're very welcome to ask it if you feel it's the way forward.
Okay, thank you, Chairman, and good evening, Mr. Howard. I think I will ask the question if you don't mind. So,
sure.
How would you encourage the recruitment of police staff and volunteers from minority sections of the community, please? I appreciate you've partly answered that question.
Yeah, okay, I have partly answered it, but actually I think this is more specific about how I might then do that. So in terms of encouraging that and encouraging the recruitment, obviously building on what I've just said, it is about me being visible and it is about me being vocal on this, and it is about me setting out my own personal standards and expectations so the rest of the force understand that and start to behave in that way. And if we really get this right, diversity and inclusion should never ever be a standalone project as it is. It should just be who we are as Lincolnshire Police, who we are as Lincolnshire, full stop. So I think the things I'd be looking at here to encourage the recruitment of police staff and volunteers, support and mentoring schemes. How can we encourage people from those diverse backgrounds and underrepresented backgrounds to come in and look at what we're doing, put support in around positive action, So if they need help with their application form, with CV building, with interview preparation, how can we put that in and make sure that they're getting the support and playing on a level playing field with everybody else? Where are our role models in force as well? So we have a number of support networks. So who are the role models in force who can actually be out there and telling people about just how good Lincolnshire Police is? I think we can then start to think about where apprenticeships and attachments should work. And that's something I presented to the Commissioner in my interview and part of my vision and strategy. And actually trying to bring apprenticeships in from the most deprived and underrepresented groups, rather than it just being from a wider and broader perspective. So actually, again, doing everything with purpose. Where are our most underrepresented groups and how do we focus our time on that? And I think we also need to consider, if I'm really honest about it, the role of the uniform in this, because the uniform can be off-putting to some communities. So is there more flexibility in how we use our service and how we use our people to engage and communicate? And then things that I've done in the past in Derbyshire was basically break some of the rules around language, because we have certain standards around English language. But in Derbyshire, what we had was a huge Polish population that we couldn't communicate with. And then we wouldn't let Polish people in because English was their second or third language because they couldn't get through the test. Now there are IT solutions and there are training courses that we can put people on and help them to adjust to that. But actually by introducing two people and breaking the rules around the language, two Polish speaking officers, they were able to engage with that community in a way that we hitherto hadn't been able to do. So going back to what I said at the very beginning, the qualities I bring, we need to be prepared to break the rules sometimes, not the law, the rules. Where the rules are getting in the way, we've got to be prepared to do that. And we've got to be clear about being role and community specific as well. If you really want to encourage volunteers from minority groups, not necessarily staff, because some of that's about pay and training, but volunteers, it has to matter to them. As a volunteer in various areas myself, I do it because it matters to me and it's things I'm passionate about. So what is it that matters to our communities that would make them volunteer?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Howard, for your comprehensive reply. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pepper. Councillor Newton, please.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Howard. What do you believe are the biggest challenges facing Lincolnshire Police, and how will you approach overcoming these?
Right. Okay, I'm going to break this into three. There's lots in my head, so forgive me if this one goes on a bit. So I think that the top three that I would be working on would be clarity of purpose and direction. And I think that links back to the staff survey that's just come out. The G4S exit and how we do that. And I think G4S use a phrase called exiting with excellence. So how are we going to do that? And the third part is really about the officer and staff morale that's just come out. So if I just go back through those three things. So clarity of purpose and direction. When I was doing my research, and I think it comes out in the staff morale survey, officers are feeling a little bit lost as to what's expected of them and feeling a little bit confused. I think there's an expectation that they should do everything and as a result feel pulled from pillar to post. So I'd like to condense that down to a much clearer strategy and direction. And this is what I presented to the Commissioner in my interview, and simply bring it to a common united purpose around protecting people from harm, which is fundamentally the core role of the police service, stopping crime and stopping criminals. And the reason I say stopping crime and criminals is that sometimes stopping the crime may be about rehabilitation and seeing how we can refocus criminals and get them out of an offending behaviour. But stopping criminals is also necessary where that's not possible and people are going to continue in their criminal activity. And then the final bit is to make sure that we're helping people in need. So give people that, officers and staff, that clarity of direction about what we're going to do. I think the other part that I would say in there is that Lincolnshire Police haven't had a control strategy for nearly 8 years now. So there is a force management statement which talks about where the gaps are in resourcing and funding. but what they haven't got is a control strategy that prioritises activity against threat type, crime type and vulnerability. So I'd like to bring that back. It's something I've been doing in the East Midlands around the control strategy and pillars of work that sit underneath that, supported by protect, prevent, pursue and I always forget the fourth one, but a 4 Ps plan underneath it to refresh where we're going. And then there needs to be a relook at the performance board, because at the moment that looks purely at quality of service. It's not really looking at where the crime performance is and getting a grip of that crime across the county. In terms of making sure officers know how we're going to do that, it's about heads up, me going out and talking to them and telling them what the strategy is, what the direction is going to be. At the moment, this is my strategy, it's what's in my head. I've talked to you about my leadership style. One of the things I'd want to do is go out and present it and let people feedback to me and adapt it and change it based on that feedback. So I'm not going to dictate this, it's got to be done on feedback. Second one, G4S, exiting with excellence. Let me rattle through this, otherwise we might be here all night, but it's about setting the pace. It's about the igniting purpose. There's 16, 17 months left before that contract runs out. So it's working with the PCC and making sure that we have a joint change board and exit board and looking really for that early determination of approach about what comes back in-house, what we might want to reduce or remove, what we might want to continue to outsource, and actually which part of, so does it come back into the Chief Constable or does it come back into the Police and Crime Commissioner, and making sure once we've set that agenda out that we can get some early communication out to our staff and our officers who are in those G4S sections so that we can settle them down and give them a view for the future and allow them to make their own choices, but also hopefully give them some reassurance that their future remains with Lincolnshire Police. And to drive that, there needs to be a really good team of credible people to deliver it. Now, I need to do that research because I still don't know all of the people in Lincolnshire Police, but we need to find the right people to do it who can drive that forward with credibility, with integrity, and with the confidence of the force. And the third one, which I think is absolutely critical at the moment, is the officer and staff morale. Whilst the survey that's come out this week is purely from the federated ranks, my research suggests that that is across the board. The feedback I've had from the Superintendents Association and from Unison would mirror quite a lot of what was said in that staff survey. So I need to go out and actually listen to people. And this is an approach I took in Derbyshire when I first got there. There was a similar position there. Actually personally go out, talk to people, listen to them, assess what's happening, and then make decisions from that point onwards. Not to come jumping in my size 10s and treading all over it, because that would be counterintuitive and counterproductive to what's been said. I talked at the beginning about the psychological contract. I am a great believer in this, is I am as accountable to the people who work for me as I am to the Commissioner. I ask them to go out day in, day out and put their lives at risk in many cases, and they should have every right to come and challenge me about the decisions I'm making and understand why those decisions are made, and they should have a voice in that. So that psychological contract needs to be set out squarely between me and everybody in the force. And I said I'm already planning to meet with the chair of the Federation to talk about how we go forward with this, but I will be talking to other stakeholders as well and making sure that we involve everybody and empower them. But I want to empower our officers and our staff to actually make changes themselves. So where they can see things that they can improve and it can be done easily with minimal cost, let them get on with it, but trust them to try it and try it and try it. And if it fails, fail fast and move on, because that's where real innovation comes from. But that requires some training and input to help them do that. And those experiences I've had, I've done a lot of work in the past with Rolls-Royce, with a company called Go Mad Thinking, a company called Purple Beach, and General Electric as well. But that has to be supported by the Chief Constable from the top. But I think there's an awful lot we can do there to engage officers and staff across the board to give them some power and enable them to make changes themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. The next question, Mr. Howard, from me. If you're successful in this process, how are you going to overcome the challenges caused by COVID-19, both to the police and your staff and the public of Lincolnshire?
Right. So can I just check, are we looking future forward, or are we looking at how I've approached it so far?
Future forward.
Future
Please.
forward. Okay. So I'm going to be really honest here. I think that the COVID, whilst it's causing us some difficulties here, also presents some huge opportunities. And by huge opportunities, what I mean, and I think I've touched on some of these already, it's changed the way that we deliver our service. It's changed the way that we communicate. And I'm not just talking about policing, I'm talking about life in general. It will change the way that policing can offer employment. It will change the way that we deploy officers and staff. And for a big county like Lincolnshire, I think that's really important, because it means we can deploy from much more remote locations and keep in touch and protect people in a different way. It means that we can investigate in a different way, because we have, and I have been doing that across EMSU. My crime scene investigators have done quite a lot online through video conferencing and been able to determine what they need to go to and which bits they can just simply do over the phone and over video conferencing. So I think there's a lot we can be doing there about changing our offer of employment, which I mentioned before can change how we then recruit people from minority groups. I think we can reach people who are less accessible in a different way. I think we can have a huge impact on our response times as a result of that, and in terms of how we do our call handling and call resolution and incident resolution in the ops room. But I think there's a flip side to this, and I think this is where partnership and collaboration comes in. And the bit I was talking about, community solutions, is we are going to see a downturn in the economy, and we are going to see more and more people out of work, and we are going to see a lag between that happening and people getting back to normal and employment picking up again. And I think the police service has a great deal of work to do to engage with those communities and reassure them, but also work in partnership about how do we regenerate, how do we work together to try and make communities safe so they become attractive to businesses to come and invest in those areas. How do I work with the Chamber of Commerce, and how do I work with other partners? So again, the business partnering, the university partnering, making sure that we are engaged with those partnerships and looking for the opportunities that come whilst communities rebuild and people pick up their lives again, and we come through this crisis. So a lot of it's going to be about communication. A lot of it's going to be about setting, again, the ambition and making sure, as a Chief Constable, I set the ambition for Lincolnshire Police about more home working, more flexible working, better recruitment from diverse and underrepresented groups, and potentially from our most deprived areas, but also then working in partnership and collaboration to make sure we make, as I said in my strategy and vision to the Commissioner, to make sure that we work together to make Lincolnshire the safest place to live, work and visit. And I think that's eminently achievable over the next 3 to 5 years.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that response, Mr. Howard. Next question, Councillor Boutroyd, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you provide an example that demonstrates your ability to manage change in an innovative way, and how you inspire colleagues to follow your lead and do things differently?
Okay, I think there's lots of things I could go through here, from the operating model in Derbyshire, surveillance operations room, which I'm leading on nationally, some of the work that I've been doing across the East Midlands over the past couple of years. So I think the best one, because I think this is probably most relevant to where Lincolnshire is at the moment, is the operating model in Derbyshire. So when I came in as an Assistant Chief Constable there, the operating model in Derbyshire was struggling, largely because of the way the resources were split. The geography was playing out in that. You've got a huge geographic area in the north of the county. So rather than an east-west split, Derbyshire was split north-south. And you have the High Peak sitting in the middle from Chesterfield over to Glossop, and difficulties in actually managing that, and very small numbers of resources at the top end of it. And when I arrived, we were sitting as a force on 300 plus incidents every day that had been unresourced from the previous 24 hours. What that 300 incidents then hid was a number of another few hundred sitting in queues, in crime queues elsewhere, that also weren't getting managed. And officers were feeling under pressure, unsafe in the way they were working, and really struggling. So where I went to, and it goes back to my leadership style, was looking at how I could engage officers and staff in designing the solutions themselves. So rather than me as a chief officer saying, right, you're going to do it this way, I again am a great believer in the people at the front end are the ones who know best. They're the ones living and breathing it, and they're the ones who can see the solutions. And quite often there are really innovative groups there struggling to get their solutions heard, and you need to go out and find it. And I'm a great believer in a writer, a business writer called Linda Grattan, who talks about creating and igniting purpose and spanning boundaries. And that's very much the approach I take, is go out, talk to people, listen to what they're saying, give them the chance to give their ideas and harvest those ideas, let them design the solution, which is exactly what we did, and enable them to implement it and own it. And that's what happened. So there were changes in the supervisory structure, which would feed back into some of the survey results that have come out this week around number of sergeants and ability to recruit people. There were changes in how sergeants would span across different teams so that we weren't duplicating work. And we changed the resource levels in the High Peak and across Glossop and Buxton area. So they designed the solution. All I did was empower it and authorize it, and then spent a lot of time out in those areas checking that it was working. And the result of that was we went from a workforce that were feeling under pressure and not listened to a position where actually they felt they owned the solution, they felt in control of it, their morale went up, their sense of purpose was improved, the teamwork improved across the board, so we didn't have CID and neighbourhoods and response officers seeing themselves in silos. And we went from a position of the 300 plus on the queue every day to less than 20, after less than 20 unresourced incidents every 24 hours. And largely those 20 were because victims or witnesses weren't available to see us at that point. So huge impact. But that again comes back to my personal approach. And again, one of the things I did from the outset was to set out that psychological contract with them to make sure that they could hold me to account. And the key things they asked me to be in that psychological contract was to be honest, make decisions when I can on the best information available, and to explain my rationale. So even when it's not what they wanted to hear, the fact that I've explained my decisions to them made it easier for them to get on with it and to accept it. And I think that's what Lincolnshire really needs at the moment. There's a great time to change. There's work that has to happen and is already happening, and there's real opportunity to build on what's already happening to allow Lincolnshire to kind of step up there and take ownership of some of its own solutions.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. I think empowering officers and staff to look for solutions is certainly a great way and support them in doing so. So yeah, totally agree, and thank you for your answer.
Thank you, Councillor Boothroyd. Mr. Kravitz, you've got a couple of questions, so over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Howard. Two questions, and they are linked together. What experience do you have of delivering savings and efficiencies for police forces? And how will you work to improve service delivery at a time of constrained finances? And I'm sure you'll find whenever you've worked, it's always been constrained finances. I'm interested in your answer on that point.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a time where I haven't worked within constrained finances. Certainly in the last decade, anyway. So just to give you a feel for where I've been on this, so when austerity first hit, I was the project manager and project lead for Leicestershire Police. I then stepped into Derbyshire as an ACC, just described some of the work that happened there around the operating model, which also happened to be linked to some of the financial constraints. And the Commissioner will support me that the last 2.5, 3 years in the East Midlands has been very much around financial pressures and value for money and how we can do something different and work within those constrained finances. So I will come back to where I've been in the East Midlands, but I'm also, there's slight, probably err on the side of optimism, if I'm honest, where I may see this slightly different to other people, in that sometimes I think those constrained finances present opportunities as well as risk, and they force you to think a little bit differently. And interestingly, when I had to do my psychological testing for the interview, the psychological testing showed that I relish this kind of opportunity or this kind of situation. And even the occupational psychologist described me as a little bit of a masochist when it came to it. And the reason for that is actually, out of those kind of austerity times and pressure, you sometimes find some really innovative solutions. But in terms of answering the question about delivering service in time of constrained finances, I think there are 4 areas I'd probably think about. The first is about prioritising your effort and acting with purpose. So it goes back to the strategy that I presented to the Commissioner in my interview, is everything we do must be set against clear priority, must have a purpose. I get a sense at the moment that that clarity of purpose maybe isn't quite as tight as it should be. And that means looking at your performance framework, making sure that is focused on the key areas. It comes back to having a clear strategic assessment and control strategy against that, so we know where we're prioritising everything. Clear baseline of where the force is and where the gaps are at the moment, and making sure that we then act against those gaps, and we're trying to address them, and we work against that control strategy. So very much what I said about my vision and the 3 priorities: protect from harm, stop crime and criminals, and help those in need. Let's get that clarity of purpose first. Second bit goes back to a couple of questions that I've already answered, which is to engage everybody in the solution, and not be fearful of constrained finances. Yes, it does present threats to people, but that threat is much greater to those individuals at a very kind of visceral level if they're not involved in the solution, because they feel like they haven't got control. So again, engage everybody, and that's the approach I've taken across the East Midlands, in Derbyshire, across EMOPS when I was doing that, and my national portfolios around surveillance. It does work, but it needs personal lead. It needs me to lead it as a Chief Constable. It is time consuming, but the payback for it is worth every minute that you put into it. The third part is accepting that we cannot do this alone. We must work in partnership, and we must collaborate with different agencies, different organisations, and we must work with our communities. And if we look across the Safer Lincolnshire partnerships, if we look across how county council is operating and where public service is, when you boil it all down, we're all trying to achieve the same thing, which is to make lives better for the people who live in Lincolnshire. So how do we collaborate together, and how do we understand where there will be mutual benefit to collaborate and create that collaborative mindset? So we're always thinking about that, always working together, always looking for where the opportunity is. But we must do that with purpose again. So I've worked in collaboration now for over 10 years, and one of the biggest risks to collaboration is that you do it for the sake of collaboration rather than for a clear purpose, or you do it in a way that actually isn't how people understood they were going to go into collaboration. So make sure it's purposeful, make sure it's beneficial to everybody. And if you don't see the purpose and the benefit to it, then we've got to be mature enough to say, let's not bother, because we're just wasting each other's time, and let's move on to the next one and find where it is worth doing. Because once we understand that, we can leverage support from each other. So if I, as a Chief Constable, know where my gaps in service are, where my gaps in skills are, I should be looking to leverage that from partners, from communities, from other agencies. And likewise, I should be willing to support those partners in filling some of their gaps where we need to. And by doing that, we build trust and confidence. And going back to my values and the integrity and the honesty, we must keep our promises and do what we say we're going to do. And that's where the community solutions team I mentioned before, and the investment in that, and the diversity and inclusion team, they all come into that kind of vision. And then the final bit I'd say is, because this is about the relationship between myself and the Commissioner, is I think there's a role between the two of us to look at that commissioning framework, because if we're really going to make Lincolnshire an attractive place for businesses, for people to live, work and visit, and to feel safe when they're here, then we've got to look at where social enterprise and the corporate social responsibility might come in, and how I, as a Chief Constable, might be able to harness the Commissioner's role and the Commissioner's powers around engaging those communities, NGOs, businesses and partners, and actually commissioning community solutions and other partnerships, and just working as a partnership with the Commissioner himself to drive some of this. So yes, constrained finances are difficult to deal with, but we shouldn't be fearful of them, because quite often they lead to better solutions. I will be fighting for the budget of Lincolnshire Police because it is underfunded in comparison to most other police forces in the country. But at the same time, the reality is we are going to continue to face that constrained position, and there are opportunities in there, but you have to meet them head on, and you have to meet them positively.
Thank you very much for that very comprehensive and welcome strategic approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kraviatz. Councillor Marsh, next question, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I think mine is based about partnerships. I think the answer that that Mr. Howard gave the last time was very full and succinct, and I think it covers this subject topic.
Okay, thank you.
If you're agreeable, I'll not ask it.
No, that's fine. Thank you. So the next question from Councillor Waring, please. You're on mute, Councillor Waring.
My apologies. Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Howard has given me a great deal of information to answer my next question, but I would like to just ask, can you provide an example which demonstrates your ability to strategically plan and collaborate with other organisations, please?
I could bore you to death on this one, because that's been my life for the last decade. So I will try and keep this one more succinct than I have done. So the primary example has to be the role I'm in at the moment. So Deputy Chief Constable for the East Midlands. The core function of that is actually leading East Midlands Special Operations Unit, which is recognised as the largest police collaboration in the UK. It tackles everything from serious and organised crime to counter-terrorism to major crime investigation, covert policing, forensic services, and on and on and on. And so in terms of that strategic planning and collaboration, this is about collaboration with 5 police forces. It's collaboration with forensic service providers. It's collaboration on a national level with other regional organised crime units and with our security partners. And I think it's fair to say over the past 3 years, it's been a tense and difficult environment to work in. And there have been multiple stakeholders with very, very different views on that. So in terms of the strategic planning, it's been very much about listening and engaging with those stakeholders, making sure that with the values I've spoken about before, that I position myself at the middle of that as the honest broker, and that I was the person that all Chief Constables and PCCs could trust, despite there being differences of opinion between some of them. And that helped alleviate some of those pressures, but it also allowed me to then talk to the Chief Constables and the PCCs about the way forward and my views and how this would go on, and also work with courts, Crown Prosecution Service, and then also my own officers and staff who work with me. And then within the strategic planning part, I commissioned a value for money review, a baseline of our performance, a baseline of our officers and staff and our establishment and their utilisation rate. So what were they doing and was it adding value? And if it wasn't adding value, how do you get rid of it? About how you could access our service, and about clarity of the role of EMSU itself, so East Midlands Special Operations Unit. And through that, we were able to identify our capabilities and our capacity, but also where the gaps were, and start to build that into the strategic vision, mission and values, and put that into my strategy. But that also included a piece around future visioning, which I've done with all of the stakeholders, but also by commissioning work through local universities, through the East Midlands Academic Partnership, to make sure that we're looking at the as yet unknowns, I suppose, the Donald Rumsfeld kind of approach, and that unmet demand that we know is coming through. So that's allowed me to invest in areas around digital investigation and the digital space, which is going to be critical to all policing in the next 3 to 5 years. And that strategic planning and collaboration and taking things forward has gone from a position of real tension to one where I think, although the tensions are still there, they're nowhere near as extreme as they used to be. And there is a real kind of buy-in now to what MSU can deliver. In the past year, it's realised £5.5 million in savings. And going back to the previous question, actually, I probably should have raised this as the evidence of how you can work in constrained finances. We took £5.5 million in savings out as a result of that planning and collaboration. But at the same time, 20% uplift in productivity, 200% increase in the people charged, nominals charged, and a 54% increase in years sentenced. But more importantly, the change in direction that I've asked for in East Midlands Special Ops Unit is more around the protect and prevent piece. And we've seen the number of safeguarding profiles increase by over 90%. So it's gone from low figures to several hundred being put through and into national referral mechanisms or into adult or child safeguarding, depending on which forces we're in. So a real change in direction. Lots of money saved, lots of planning, lots of buy-in by engaging people at the very beginning, and still taking the money out and seeing the productivity go up.
Thank you very much indeed. I've always enthused about cost-benefit analysis of everything anyone does, and I really do feel that it is so beneficial to actually use things in that way. I'm warming to you greatly. I enjoyed the words. And I do look forward to the actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Waring. Next question, Councillor Wotton, please. You're on mute, Councillor Wotton.
My apologies, Chairman. I think Mr. Howard has answered part of this question, but what I'd like to put to Mr. Howard, he's talking about engaging with staff. What about the volunteers, those special constabulary officers, the volunteer PCSOs and all volunteers? How would you communicate with them? Okay, I think it goes back to the same approach I've been talking about already, but I will come to the specific part of it. But the other part I'd say is communication is also a two-way thing. And I don't mean that in a kind of I'll just pass the buck over to them. What I mean is, as a chief constable, I need to give people permission to contact me directly and to feel that I'm accessible to them. That takes time and it takes trust and it takes evidence. So the more I do it, the more people will see it, and then more and more people will take me up on that. And I've seen that over the past few years in MSU and when I was in Derbyshire. But in terms of volunteers, I love volunteers. I volunteer myself in my own life, and as ACC in Derbyshire, I was responsible for the volunteers there. Saw police cadets double in size, and we introduced the mini cadets as well. And the way to approach this still has to be the personal approach. As a chief constable, I will want to go out and meet them. I know that will take time. But if you take cadets have training evenings that you can go to. If I go out and meet with special constables when they're on patrol, they will have training days. Can I get into those? But it's also about making sure that any messaging we have, whether it's by social media or email, is also getting to them at home, not necessarily on police computer systems where they miss messages. So it's very much about the personal approach. It's also about the staff networks and making sure. I'm not quite sure what the relationship is in Lincolnshire between special constables and Federation, but that was something I tried to improve upon in Derbyshire around the support the Federation could give to them. And again, how Unison might then be able to support police staff volunteers as well, accepting that they're not going to be full members, but it's that wrapping an arm around them, telling them that they're valued, making sure that they're supported and making sure that they not only see me and hear from me, but they also have permission to contact me and have access to me when they need it. Thank you, Mr. Howard. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Wotton. Councillor Newton, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Howard, we've heard you mention quite a bit about your communications with staff and the uniform section.
Yeah.
What experience do you have in communicating with the wider public to increase their confidence in local policing?
Okay, quite extensive on this one. So again, the operating model for Derbyshire required quite a lot of external communication with the public because that was a confidence issue. I've dealt with police shootings, terrorist events, the use of stop and search in Leicestershire. I was the lead for that when Leicestershire were engaged by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. That required extensive public engagement with particular communities as well. But I think the example I'm going to give you is actually about armed patrols, Christmas patrols. Partly it's a nice seasonal one, but when I was Assistant Chief Constable in Derbyshire, and you may recall this because it did play across Lincolnshire and the rest of the East Midlands, but I took a decision as the lead for armed policing in Derbyshire not to have armed foot patrols in shopping centres and city centres, but to retain a mobile armed presence that would do random spot checks and random foot patrols in different locations. And that played out in the media because it stood out against all of the other forces in the East Midlands around why we were doing something different and why I felt that would keep people safe. So I ended up doing 2 one-hour-long phone-ins on BBC Radio Derby to talk about my decision-making. I did press articles, I did briefings of our own teams. So when my armed officers went out, it was very much about when you park up your car and when you get out and do the random foot patrols, go and talk to the public. Don't be aloof, don't be standoffish because you happen to be carrying a gun, be ambassadors of the force. And really the rationale that I was putting out there was, and I think this should apply to Lincolnshire, and I will be looking at it as a Chief Constable, when you come to those patrols in a county that is so spread out like Derbyshire, putting what limited armed resources you have into one static position or 2 or 3 static positions doesn't give you resilience and doesn't give you coverage and doesn't build confidence in other towns and shopping areas around the wider county. And actually, if I was a terrorist, I'd be looking at it and thinking, well, actually, that's where they are. I'll go somewhere different. So by having more random and sporadic checks, we were able to kind of make it a little bit more difficult to predict where we were going to be. But also, if something happened somewhere else, we were ready to move and roll, and armed officers were there and ready to respond rather than having to kit up, get back in a vehicle and then travel off. So I spent a lot of time doing face-to-face phone-ins and briefing officers and making sure that across the board we were getting that message out and explaining the rationale behind it and explaining why I'd taken those decisions. And by the end of both of the hour-long phone-ins, I was getting direct feedback saying, we agree with that, we think that's the right response. And it actually led to a change in response, certainly in Leicestershire, the following year, not that year, but the following year. And actually, I think now all police forces in terms of those armed patrols are less static and more mobile, still visible, but definitely a change in approach.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Councillor Bootroyd, next question, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you provide an example of a time when you had to react to and lead on delivering an improvement to the outcome of an investigation or report?
I think it's an inspection report.
Sorry, inspection report.
Okay, so I presume here we're talking things like HMI CFRS reports and okay.
Yeah.
I've probably used a prime one there with the operating model in Derbyshire. So let me expand on the operating model in Derbyshire then, because I think it's worth going into the other part of this. Was so the operating model, not only have you got officers who are feeling a little bit under pressure, and that was fed back into the HMI report, but incident response wasn't being managed. Obviously, the 300 sitting on a queue, lots sitting in unresourced, lots of investigations sitting in sergeant's queues or constable queues not being dealt with. The other part to that was the beginning. So when the call comes in, the force operations room, the contact management centre, how were those calls being dealt with? How were they being managed and graded? Was a specific area within that HMIC report. And again, I was fortunate, I think, as an ACC, because I'd previously been head of the force operations room in Leicestershire. So I, sadly for my sins, understand the technology that sits behind it. But I spent a lot of time sitting in the contact management room, looking at the telephony systems, looking at the command and control system, talking to the staff and officers who worked in there, and the problems they were facing around lack of visibility of resources, inability to see previous contacts. So if I was a member of the public ringing in and I'd rung in 10 times before that, they had no idea that had happened. Nothing, no customer relations system at all. So they were sitting on an antiquated command and control platform. There was a lack of prioritization of the jobs because the system really just didn't support it. So there was an overgrading of the immediates and the urgents, and not enough sitting in the kind of standard grading and those that then could be resolved through telephone contact or other contacts. So it was just a really poor deployment and deferral practice, not because of any officers and staff's own practices, but just because the force was sitting on really bad systems at that time. So in terms of responding to the inspection report, within that year, my first year as an ACC, we procured and implemented a new command and control system. We brought in an incident resolution team, which used a very young but energetic and knowledgeable sergeant with a number of officers who happened to have either permanent restrictions or long-term restrictions on their ability to patrol, but were still exceptionally good police officers and could sit alongside call handlers, not separate, but sit with our call handlers and our dispatchers to impart that policing knowledge and help them to make decisions and resolve incidents at the first point of contact. Alongside that, I also implemented mobile office, so Pronto, which is also a system Lincolnshire have, but we did that from a standing start in 6 months and built it in and linked it very closely to the command and control process. Now, my understanding is that Lincolnshire is now looking at new command and control processes and command and control systems, and that linking with the mobile office is also part of that. What that allowed us to do in Derbyshire, though, was to introduce voiceless dispatch. So my dispatchers could then concentrate on managing your immediate and urgent responses with voice and radio contact, whereas some of the other incidents could simply be text message and emailed out and dealt with that way, because officers could do that through their mobile office. But again, it was about involving everybody in the solution. This was not me coming in and saying, do it this way. It was me going in and engaging people, creating an environment where people could talk to their own management team and put those solutions forward. I spent hours, if not days, in the ops room watching and learning about how they would do it. And I have to say, one of the things I had to do in that was actually change the management team, because the management team who were in there were very authoritarian, very strict about what people could and couldn't do within there, and actually had basically dampened down all of the voices and all the people who knew how to put it right. So a change in management just led to a much more enabling and empowering environment in which people could work. But that was in direct response to HMIC criticism.
Great, thank you for your answer. And I think it's good to know you've got that experience and have already been through some of these changes for what Lincolnshire's going to look to put in place going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Boothroyd. Councillor Pepper, please.
Yeah, Mr. Howard, what is your experience of effectively handling major critical incidents, and how did you support officers in dealing with the aftermath of such events?
Okay. In terms of what's my experience, I think I would describe it as extensive. And that's everything from being a gold public order commander and gold firearms. Well, I've gone all the way through from tacticals to strategic firearms and public order commander. I'm also a specialist firearms commander, so that's about responding to terrorist incidents. And I obviously now manage and run East Midlands Special Operations Unit, so major crime, serious organised crime, and again counter-terrorism. So I was responsible for the response to the terrorist threat in Chesterfield and the armed response to that. But I think in terms of the question you've just asked, the answer I'll give is about a police shooting in Derbyshire, because it was just a horrible incident all round for everybody to deal with. And armed officers were sent to a male with a gun, and they arrive on the scene. They recognise the male because they've dealt with him in the past week. They know that he has mental health difficulties, and they know that he's suicidal. And to all intents and purposes, it presents as a suicide by cop scenario. He has got a gun. It is and was found to be a viable weapon, and because he'd had previous experience of the police, he was cute enough not to let them get close to him, so we couldn't use non-lethal weapons, so baton rounds or taser, to try and control the situation without him coming to harm. And the situation escalated to a point where he started to point and threaten the police officers with the gun, and they were left with no choice but to shoot him. Now, I have to say, there is a happy end to this because he didn't die. They hit him twice in the chest and missed every vital organ, which is a real positive. But from the officer's point of view and from the control room point of view, they don't know that's going to happen because he's gone away to hospital. It's to their mind, they've now killed somebody. So the response to that, I was responsible for armed policing at the time. It was very quickly get the post-incident management suite set up, make sure that they're being well looked after, that we've got professional standards, liaison officers with them, that I've got welfare support with them. I've got a post-incident manager looking after them and looking after the way they present their evidence, and making sure everything is done by the book because they're going to be in a stress state. And making sure all of those immediate needs are put in place, including the referral to the IOPC because of the shooting, but also because of the previous police contact. And then very quickly setting up a gold group, which I chaired, which then looked at the wider care of not just the officers and the staff, but actually the family of the subject, and making sure we engaged with his mother, who, fair play to her, was extremely understanding of what had happened and cast no blame on the police for this, and was actually apologetic for what had happened. And then making sure that we briefed the Chief Constable and the PCC, and making sure that media responses were balanced and informed on a number of levels. Firstly, that the officers, so that the immediate support from me is that the officers were being well looked after. I obviously can't comment on the rights and wrongs of the situation at that time, but I'd made that clear to the officers. But also making sure the media didn't make any wrongful or disparaging comments about the victim himself and the victim's family. So managing the media part. As time went on, I also made sure that I was in regular contact and personal contact with the officers within some certain parameters because of the IOPC investigation. So there's an independence that had to be kept. And using my experience from Leicestershire Police, where I introduced something called trauma risk management, which is a military process called TRIM for short. Derbyshire didn't have that at the time, but I brought it in Leicestershire and was actually the first force in the country to use TRIM. So I brought in colleagues from Leicestershire on a goodwill basis, purely because I knew them, and said, I want trauma risk management for these officers and these staff. What that does is a military process that looks at or tries to identify post-traumatic stress in the 2 weeks after, a month after, and 6 months after. So there's the constant check and balance there to make sure the officers are okay, and that we're looking for the signs of PTSD if it comes in. And then really importantly for the officers was the ongoing communication with the IOPC to force an early decision around whether there was going to be an investigation of wrongdoing or not, and trying to make sure that that decision came in as quickly as possible. And it did. We got that decision within just under 2 weeks to say there was nothing to answer. It was a lawful shooting and they weren't going to pursue any investigation. That immediately calms things down. And from an officer point of view, there was no suspension from duty. I took that decision very quickly. I allowed them as much time as they felt they needed at home and to manage their own welfare, obviously with the support in the background. But to return to work, they couldn't go back into an armed capacity until the IOPC decision had been made. But to make sure that they felt valued and that we didn't cut off a key support network for them, which is their colleagues at work. Because we're really good at that in policing, about sending people home and forgetting that a lot of their mates are actually at work at the same time. And then longer term was the debrief and learning from that. And that was about, well, what can we learn from it? There was no fault, no blame attached to any of that. It was just make sure that we take this forward. How could we have done it differently? And actually we found we couldn't, which reassured the officers again. And again, my personal style about just being open and honest and supportive and being compassionate to them as well, and showing genuine care for them, which again, will be bringing as the chief in Lincolnshire.
Okay, thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Pepper. Councillor Wotton, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Howard, what would your approach be to achieving improved crime outcomes for victims, including an increase in the identification of suspects and improved conviction rates?
I think that goes back to the answer I gave earlier. I think the first part is we need to bring back a control strategy. We need to understand where the specific threat and risk is. Where at the moment the Lincolnshire feel, and I may be wrong because I haven't been able to do a full assessment and I've got to come back in and listen and learn. But I think we need to introduce a control strategy to understand where the threat and risk is coming from. What are the crime types that are hurting our communities most? And how are we then going to focus our resources on it? So at the moment, there's clear risks around increased domestic violence and some of the conviction rates and arrest rates around rape and associated domestic violence with that. And there's a lot of work around vulnerability and protecting people from harm. So I think the starting point is let's understand what our priorities are. The second part is let's baseline, excuse me, baseline where our performance is now and make sure we understand that. Understand where our gaps are in our skills and capability and then do something to address that or reprioritize your resources to meet the key threats and risks in there. And then look where, again, coming back to my part about collaboration and partnership, look where we can work in partnership to address that and drive that performance and improve across that. And if we get all of this right, then what we should be seeing is a much higher motivation and clarity of purpose from our officers and staff. We should see a clear performance framework that identifies not only the hard measures around driving crime down, and actually sometimes I won't, as a chief constable, be asking for crime to be driven down. I'll want the reporting to go up, particularly where we're talking about vulnerable victims, whether that's about slavery, whether it's about rape, whether it's about domestic violence, because we all know that they're underreported. So how do you build the confidence? And how do you accept that sometimes crime rates will go up if you build that confidence? So it's about bringing all of that in and the hard measures, but it's also about the softer measures, about the quality of service, the way we treat our victims and our witnesses, and the way we also bring offenders to justice, and then how we work in partnership to rehabilitate and divert people from offending, particularly where you've got that persistent offending, which invariably will happen in a domestic abuse situation that I've been using as an example. And often what we do is we do a lot of work with the victims of it, and we don't do a great deal of work with the offenders and think about how you might take them out of that offending behaviour. So there's lots I could do there, and apologies, I could rattle on about how the performance might then follow.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Howard. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Wotton. Mr. Howard, we have a few questions on the subject of personal independence next. So, Councillor Young, please. You're on mute, Councillor Young.
All right. What steps would you take if you felt the Commissioner was preparing to do something which you felt strayed into operational policing?
The first thing I'd say is I'd hope we'd never get to that position, because the Commissioner and myself should be speaking on a regular basis, and we should know pretty much day in, day out what steps we're about to take and where our concerns are. And having worked with the Commissioner, because he has the APCC lead for serious and organised crime, we already have that relationship, which was a very big part of my rationale for actually applying. But should he step out of character and start to do that, then the starting point for me would be to speak to him again and sit down and have a very open and frank discussion about what his rationale is, and try and understand what steps he's trying to take, and then look at where the common approach and the boundaries for that approach might be, because obviously the operational role and the direction and control of my officers and my staff and the delivery of policing effectively sits with me as a Chief Constable, but there are roles that the Commissioner can play in helping to deliver that, and particularly when it comes to the politics around funding and government direction and things like that. So it'd just be about sitting down and making sure we understood where each other was coming from, finding a common approach to it and finding the mutually beneficial way of dealing with it. If we then still can't get to that point, which I hope we wouldn't now be stepping beyond this, then there's a whole team of people around us that I could call on and that the Commissioner could call on. So there's a Deputy Chief Constable, there's a Deputy PCC, there's a Chief Executive, there's Assistant Chief Officer and Chief Constable. And actually by bringing the broader team together, we may get a more collegiate approach and find the right way through it. And those wider views may help to resolve the difference. If I carried on from there, the next step I'd go into would probably be looking at the support and counsel of peers in the region. So we both have trusted colleagues amongst the PCCs and amongst the chief officers, and we could ask for that peer review. So actually there are 3 steps there where you can resolve this quite amicably without it ever being a fallout between PCC and Chief Constable. And I would expect pretty much everything we're doing to be resolved in the first step, and I hope never to get into the second and third step. If I have to go on any further, then the policing protocol steps in and you start to rely on the legislation and the Act, and then you start to look at the case law that sits behind that, where there have been fallouts between Chief Constables and PCCs, but that's not where I want to be. I want to have a really positive and open relationship with the Commissioner. I don't want one where it's negative and conflicting. And the Commissioner and I are, as I said, we have a relationship already. We're both big enough and mature enough to find a compromise where we have the difference. And we do that now. We go to the same meetings and we may have a different view in those meetings, and we present them openly and honestly. And that relationship is a very positive one as it exists already, and I expect it to continue as a Chief Constable.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Young. Councillor Wotton? I think you're on mute as well, Councillor Wotton, please. Thank you.
Sorry about that, Chairman. Mr. Howard, you've already alluded to part of this question, but how you plan to work with the Commissioner to deliver the current and future police and crime plans whilst maintaining the independence of Lincolnshire Police?
Okay, so I think the key bits here, and I'm going to try and avoid referring to the legislation, because I always find that kind of makes it really formal and not quite where I'd want the relationship to be with the Commissioner. So being really, really honest about this, the reasons I've applied to be the Chief Constable of Lincolnshire is, firstly, I think having worked across the region, I think it's a fantastic force with fantastic people. Secondly, I like the police and crime plan and what it says in there about working together and safer together, about effective policing, about listening and responding and being accountable to our communities and to the people that we serve. All of those things are reflected in my own personal values and hopefully how I've come across this evening. In terms of then delivering the delivery plan, like the Chief Constable's plan, The independence of that comes in having regard to what the police and crime plan has said, but actually the strategy that I've set out has been based on my own research, has been based on what my stakeholders have been saying, has been based upon the data that I've been looking at. And as you take account of the strategic threat and risk assessment, and as I bring in a control strategy that I've been talking about, there's a wealth of data and information there that allows me to then make decisions in an objective and impartial way using that data, but also then taking account of community engagement, feedback, looking at confidence figures, using the crime and policing survey, and helping that, using that to help inform my plan itself. But the independence comes from having that clear data and clear objectives and clear prioritization of your threat and risk. The police and crime plan and the chief constable's plan should mirror each other, though. They should be complementary. They shouldn't be conflicting, because they're based upon the same data, really. They're based upon identifying the same threat. They're based upon the feedback from the same communities. It's based upon the survey data that comes in that is used by both the Commissioner and the Chief Constable. So there is always going to be complementary work there. But in terms of the direction and control, it comes down to the control strategy, strategic threat and risk assessment, and where I, as a Chief Constable, see the resources being needed at that given point in time.
Thank you, Mr. Howard, and thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Walton. Mr. Kraviatz, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Could you explain your understanding of the terms operational independence and personal independence, and how these apply to the role of Chief Constable?
So I think the operational independence is really what I've just been talking about. It's about the direction and control of the resources of my police officers and police staff who are working for Lincolnshire Police, and making sure they are directed in an impartial and an objective way to meet the needs of the communities of Lincolnshire. So I am accountable to the Commissioner, but I'm responsible to the people of Lincolnshire. And there are very subtle differences in there. And the way to do that is exactly how I've said. It's about understanding your strategic threat and risk. It's about understanding your priorities, having that clear control strategy, and using the evidence to make your decisions. Sometimes it will be about looking forward and making some forward-thinking decisions, but that operational independence is about the day-to-day directional control of my officers and staff to meet the needs of the communities of Lincolnshire. There will be work that they have to do to deliver against the Chief's plan. And as I say, the Chief's delivery plan should complement the police and crime plan. In terms of the personal independence, I think that's a slightly more ethereal concept, and isn't particularly well set out in the policing protocol nor the Act. But my personal view about this is really about the Nolan principles and about how you behave in public life, which very much, I think, mirror my own personal values. I talked about selflessness and compassion and integrity. I think those are key parts about how you maintain that personal independence. And the objectivity and openness and honesty about how you lead. And that allows me then to behave in a way that is impartial, that doesn't push me into an undue and inappropriate close affiliation, either politically or personally, with the Commissioner, but allows me to remain objective. And if I just give you an example, because I say it's ethereal, so I'm going to try and use an example to evidence this. So the position I sit in at the moment as a Deputy Chief Constable in the region, I've mentioned already, I have 5 Police and Crime Commissioners and 5 Chief Constables who all want a piece of me. So I have to remain personally independent and operationally independent of each of those, and take account of all of their views, and then come to a decision that I feel is fair, objective, and impartial to meet the needs in the best way I can of each of those 10 stakeholders and each of those 5 forces and the communities in those forces. And that's what I've been doing for the last 3 years. I have maintained my operational and personal independence. And even where I've been, because I've been a Derbyshire officer and a Leicestershire officer, I have, immediately on arriving, I was told, well, you're just going to do what Leicestershire want, you're just going to do what Derbyshire want. I have steadfastly maintained my objectivity and deliberately stepped away from some personal relationships in order to maintain that and to be seen to be fair and to uphold my own integrity and to maintain that trust across the region.
Thank you for that answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kraviatz. Mr. Howard, you'll be pleased to know this is the final question.
Okay.
And it's from me. How do you view your future relationship, if you were successful, with the Police and Crime Panel?
Positively, I think is the simple answer to that.
That'll do for me.
So yeah, I'll just expand very quick. So obviously the accountability piece is with the PCC, but I was trying to scribble down everybody's roles and what you were responsible for as you were introducing yourselves, and you forgive me, I will not remember them after this meeting, and hopefully we'll build that as I go forward. But you are going to want assurances from me as a Chief Constable that our performance is good, and you want those factual accounts, as it says. But there's a wealth of experience and there's a wealth of networks that you all have that will all be beneficial to policing in Lincolnshire and will be beneficial to the wider partnerships and the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership. I would be foolish not to use those networks and use your experience and to try and build positive relationships and use the Police and Crime Panel to help me as a Chief Constable. So yes, I do see it as a positive relationship, and I do see myself and the Commissioner working well together as Chief Constable and Commissioner.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for that. Been quite a lengthy session for you. Thank you, Commissioner, for your presence this evening and your responses to our questions, and to your staff. Thank you, Mr. Howard. We will now be looking to move to private session in a closed session to discuss our findings, and Commissioner, you will be written to with our recommendations. So if I could ask you to leave the meeting, and then I will propose that we move into closed session. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I wish you all a good Christmas.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think those gentlemen and lady have left the meeting. So I will now turn to item 5 on the agenda, where exclusion of the public and press, to consider excluding the public and press for the following item, and if appropriate for the chairman to move that under section 100A(4) of the Local Government Act 1972, the public and press be excluded from the meeting for the following item, on the grounds that if they were present, there could be disclosed to them exempt information as defined in paragraphs 1, 2 and 3 of Part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Act as amended. So do I have a proposer from the panel for that? Councillor Wotton, thank you. Do I have a seconder? Mr. Kraviatz, all in favour?
Yes.
Yeah, everybody's in favour. Thank you. So we will now move into the closed session. So thank you for that. And thank you to members of the public and press who have been listening to our